This was played on October 25th, 1959. Friðrik Ólafsson, born January 26th, 1935. He's still alive, Ólafsson. He is a grandmaster from Iceland, FIDE president from 1978 to 1982, six-time Icelandic champion, two-time Nordic chess champion. Strong player indeed. So we get e4 and c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Bobby always with the two knights attack on Caro-Kann. So knight c3, d5, knight f3. Knight f6, pawn e5 hits the knight, knight e4. Knight e2 avoids the trade, queen b6. Of course, that threatens scholar's checkmate. Bobby didn't fall for it. d4 blocks, c5, and c5 is not the book move. e6 is. You see it marked there with the arrow. This is the ECO move, e6, and then a knight g3, c5, then bishop d3 here. And the most common continuation is knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and pawn takes pawn. Back. In this game, c5 right away by Friðrik. D takes the c5 and queen takes. The queen's knight comes to d4 now. I'm going to put this up first so I don't mess up like I did the last time. Do not play queen to d4. That hangs your pawn here. Boom. So, knight ed4 is played, knight c6, bishop b5 pins the knight to the king, a6 interrogates the bishop, what are you doing in my house? And a trade is made on c6, check, and pawn takes. Now white castles, and the queen retreats to the b6 square, marked inaccurate with pawn e6 preferred. That improvement was played many years later, 2001, before this position was reached again. This improvement was played by the Russian WGM Tatiana Mokhanova against her countryman, international master Alexei Kamatgaliev. In this game, queen b6 from Ólafsson, and Fischer plays e6 to prevent Ólafsson from playing e6. F takes the e-man, bishop f4. That gets a big question mark. I actually liked knight to e5, the bot calling for c4. My thought is play the knight on f3 to e5, making way for queen h5. And I do get a star for that move. But bishop f4 played and g6. Of course, wanting to play bishop to g7. The bot calling for c5 here, hit the knight, force the knight back to e2, then play g6. g6 first by Ólafsson. Bishop e5 now, introducing himself to the rook and preventing and precluding bishop g7. Knight f6 interposes, that gets marked inaccurate. Rook g8, and black is Jim Dandy. And he can play the bishop to h6, you know, on the next turn. Instead, knight f6 was played, knight to the g5 square, super attacking the e-man. And from thence, that looks delicious. Defended by my bishop. Oh, baby. That would be a fork. Looks good. Knight g5 was answered by bishop h6. And he took this with the wrong knight, in my opinion. Let's see what the bot thinks. The bot does mark it as a mistake. And the point is, you don't want to give black the option. Maybe Bobby did want to give him this option. Maybe he was planning on playing here anyway, regardless. But if you take with this knight, that's no longer an option. And if he takes with his queen's bishop, I've got my other knight now coming in, and that's still there. So Bobby played knight d takes e6 in his chess moves. And that is marked as a mistake by the annotator. And sure enough, bishop takes the g knight. And Bobby took the bishop here. I thought maybe Bobby was deliberately playing this because you could play this anyway, right? Because that's check. And I get a star for that. And after king moves, then I grab the rook, hitting the queen. Boom. And after the queen moves, either b7, let's go to a7, leave this square for the bishop if I need it. I get a star for that. But now my knight can come back, defended by my bishop. And I've got an advantage according to the eval bar. It's winning the exchange, isn't it? However, Bobby went ahead and made it an equal trade. Knight takes the bishop on g5. Black castled. queen d2, bishop f5, queen's rook to the e1 square, queen's rook to d8, bishop back to c3, marked as a mistake. Rook d7, defending the pawn, knight e6, hitting the rook and preventing this pawn from attacking our bishop. But bishop takes the knight, removing the defender. Rook takes the bishop, and d4 is played after all. Hitting the bishop, bishop to b4, super attacking the e-man. White fighting for an advantage. Knight d5, defending and attacking. That's a super attack. So he played bishop to a3, maintaining an eye on the e-man while moving to safety. Rook f7, marked inaccurate. Rook f6 is superior, putting the question to the counterpart here on e6. And of course, probably the best move is to bring the other rook into the game, although the bot disagrees with me. But rook f7 by Ólafsson, g3, knight c7, rook e5, knight back to d5. Yeah, pawn e6 being called for, controlling these light squares, and then the possibility of bringing either rook to either of those squares. Instead, knight back to d5, queen d3, knight f6, marked as a mistake. The bot calling for c5, I was thinking a5, but the point is the same for either of these moves. Whether you play the c5 or the a5, the point is to facilitate knight b4, defended by the pawn, or by the pawn if you played c5. Instead, knight to f6, queen c4, pinning the rookie, knight g4. Right, rook d5. I already mentioned this idea a little bit ago, even though it was in response to e6, but the point is the same here. Rook d5 not only puts the question to the rook on e5, but it also vacates the d7 square, enabling knight to d7. So, for example, on rook e6, knight d7. Instead, knight g4, interrogating the rook this way. That's answered with rook e6. Again, not liked by the bot. Rook c5, the better move, battery attacking the c-man. Rook e6 instead. Queen b5, queen takes the queen, and pawn takes the queen. And this is interesting. The bot marking this inaccurate and says take with the other pawn. I'm curious about that. Normally we capture toward the center. I'm not exactly sure why this is an exception, unless the point is you're losing whichever pawn remains behind, and perhaps the suggestion is you'd rather have your opponent's rook on a6 than on, oh, I see, that's marked inaccurate, huh? Yeah, I guess, well, when I took this pawn, it said h3, so I gather when Bobby takes this pawn, it'll still say h3. It does. Kick the knight, says the bot. Kick the knight out of there, and then you can take, or even better, you probably can double your rooks. Either or. Double the rooks, I get a thumbs up, or just now take this. The one thing I might be concerned about is d3 here. Oh, that's marked inaccurate. Well, anyway, Bobby with rook takes c6 here. Oh, and knight e5. Rook c8 check, marked as a mistake. It says, hey, fork the knight and the pawn. Well, rook c8 check was played. King g7 marked as a miss. We are approaching the time control, so perhaps the clock is a factor. But rook f8 being called for, putting the question to the rook. And he's, obviously, if the trade is made, well, he doesn't have to trade. Let me think about this. If the trade is declined, let's say now I play rook c5. Knight c4, rook takes the pawn, and knight takes the bishop, and pawn takes the knight. His pawns are busted up. Well, if the trade is accepted, and that, I was right. Now he's ready to push this pawn. Come back. King G7 was played. Bishop B4, knight F3 check, King G2, pawn E5, rook D1, pawn G5, bishop F8 check. Interesting, because the rook is overworked. That's the point. So after rook takes the bishop and rook takes the rook, king takes the rook, and king takes the knight. And we get a king-rook versus king-rook endgame. King F7, rook F7 being called for. But king F7 from Ólafsson, C3, king E6 defending the rook. The bot says just break the pin and hit this pawn. Yeah, with this pawn unpinned, this can now be captured. But Ólafsson with king E6. So C takes D4, E takes D4, king E4. Super attacking the D-man. Rook F7, F3. And here, I'm sure the game was adjourned. F3 may have been a sealed move, I don't know. But whatever the case, black resigned. Note that you don't want to take this and allow rook takes F2. Although, if I play here, you can come back here. So much better is the move played by Bobby, F3. Black resigned. And you can see the eval bar concurs.